Hi again, everyone. Alexander here for 30 Days of Symphony. Well, I hope you enjoyed yesterday's bright little escapade down Mexico Way for the most famous symphony of all Mexican composers, the Sinfonia India by Carlos Chavez, who was indisputably the kind of the big man of Mexican music in the mid 20th century, the kind of the Aaron Copland of the Mexican musical establishment. Well, I think as the alphabet demands, it's all too fitting that we now move to the Aaron Copland of the American classical music 20th century establishment, otherwise known as Aaron Copland, and his greatest symphony, or should I say, being provocative, his greatest attempt at a symphony, his Symphony No. 3 of 1946. When I was growing up out on the East Coast in the 1970s, Aaron Copland was very, very much a living and vibrant fixture as the great pillar of the establishment of American classical music. He was, in the 1970s, still quite active as maybe not as so much as a composer. He had basically stopped writing music by his 70th birthday, but was still very active as a conductor. I remember him conducting the National Symphony Orchestra in Washington, D.C. during the bicentennial celebrations. In 1976, also conducting, of course, the Boston Symphony and the New York Philharmonic, two orchestras he had gotten to know very, very well over the decades. I also remember him very poignantly playing the role of the narrator in his Lincoln Portrait with his dear old friend and former composition pupil and musical comrade-in-arms, Leonard Bernstein, conducting the orchestra. Unbeknownst to me, I would later in the early 1980s have the privilege of actually getting to know him just a little. I had been, as an undergraduate at Yale, I had been writing the program notes for the Yale Philharmonia, and I came to the attention of the program annotator of the New York Philharmonic, one Philip Ramey, who had been a former pupil and was a very close friend of Aaron Copland. And one day he called me up in New Haven, Connecticut, and said, "Why don't you come to Peekskill this weekend?" Peekskill, New York, where Copland had his country house, and Aaron is hosting a lunch party. By then, in the early 1980s, Aaron was, I shouldn't say Aaron, that's presumptuous of me, Mr. Copland was deep in the throes of his final journey with Alzheimer's disease. I remember sitting out at luncheon next to him. I was kind of the bright young thing, so I was seated next to him at lunch on the patio at his home, and the conversations turned to his great contemporary, the composer Samuel Barber, who had been dead for several years by this point. And Aaron Copland turned to me and said, "Sam Barber, how's Sam? How's Sam doing?" And of course, Barber had been dead for several years, and I didn't quite know what to say. I then accompanied him in kind of an entourage when I think it was Raymond Lepard, the British conductor, conducted his last major work, a very great little piece called Inscape, which dates from 1967, and I got to sit in Mr. Copland's box at Avery Fisher Hall for that matinee performance in New York. So I had a very brief but poignant, at the most, to be accurate, acquaintanceship with Aaron Copland. But even then, in his final years, you felt this kind of Old Testament prophet presence. And I also, when I was an undergraduate at Yale, I had the privilege of being the proofreader for Murray Sidlin, the then conductor of the New Haven Symphony Orchestra and the longtime teacher of conducting at the Aspen Music Festival and School. Murray did this, to this day, this brilliant chamber orchestra adaptation of Copland's one grand opera, The Tender Land. And it was during my days as an undergraduate that the premiere performance was organized at the Long Wharf Theater in New Haven, and I was enlisted as the all-round assistant and proofreader of the score of the arrangements. So I would never ever say that I was a friend of Aaron Copland or that I was a student of him, but I did, as we say, I did truly get to touch the hem of his garment. He is, along with George Gershwin, Leonard Bernstein, and lest we forget, the great New England maverick Charles Ives, whom we'll get to later. He is the greatest of our American composers. And like Carlos Chavez in Mexico City, whom we were discussing yesterday, he was just the big man of American classical music. He was this person, along with another composer whom we, of course, love as Midwesterners, Mr. Howard Hanson, of course, who wrote the Romantic Symphony. He was, along with Howard Hanson, not only a great American composer and conductor, but a superlative educator and proselytizer, evangelist for classical music and for music education. And the result of their work was this unbelievable effervescence of classical music, of serious music, in not only in our concert halls and opera houses all over the country, but also in almost all of our public and private schools, that really engendered this golden age of American serious music. A golden age that many of us value, and I am very blessed to say in a place like La Crosse, we still hold very dear. Well, enough of my discoursing. We're here to celebrate Aaron Copland's Symphony No. 3. I said attempt at a symphony because Copland was always a reluctant symphonist. There is a Symphony No. 1, which I actually conducted during my student days at Cambridge University, which is really a glorified concerto for the organ that he wrote in tribute to his teacher, the composer and pianist and organist and conductor Nadia Boulanger. Now, you must get to know, if you have any serious interest in the still unsung role of women in classical music, you must get to know Nadia Boulanger, Boulanger. Nadia Boulanger, from the very end of World War I, was almost like immediately was the preeminent composition teacher in Paris. And it was a situation in which the Paris Conservatory, which was even then still so hidebound and conservative, did not have the intelligence to take her on as a faculty member. So she was one of the founding members of the faculty of a school that still thrives to this day, the École Normale de Musique de Paris, the normal school. It's what we in America, it's like what we call a normal school, a teacher's school, a school for music teachers. But musicians of all kinds went there just to study piano with the immortal Alfred Cortot, and conducting with the great Charles Munch, and composition with Arthur Honegger, and also, most importantly, composition with Nadia Boulanger. Basically, everyone who was someone as a composer in 20th century music studied with Nadia Boulanger, from Aaron Copland in 1921, all the way to the great American minimalist composer, still quite alive today, Philip Glass, and everyone in between, Roy Harris, Virgil Thompson, Walter Piston. George Gershwin famously went to Paris in the late 20s and begged Mademoiselle Boulanger for composition lessons, and he showed her the score to the Rhapsody in Blue, one of the, a work of like Mozart-like genius, utter total spontaneity. And Boulanger looked at the score and she said to young Mr. Gershwin, quote, "I can teach you nothing." So Gershwin went back to New York. It's true. And basically anyone who is someone in American music studied at some point with Nadia Boulanger. She was a superior woman in a man's world. She just lorded over this world of men. There were just almost no women in leadership posts in classical music at that time, but she had all those men of the establishment, she had to her dying day all of their adoration and respect. And if you don't believe me, just Google her name and go. You can see all of the countless photographs of her with everyone from Aaron Copland to Igor Stravinsky, and just everyone adored her, and they were right. She was the greatest music composition teacher of the 20th century. Well, ever since Copland had studied with Boulanger and wrote that first symphony as a kind of a de facto organ concerto for her, he struggled with the idea of being a composer of symphonies because at his heart, as the great now late British composer and conductor Oliver Nussin once said to me, Copland at heart was a French composer of ballet music. Think of how the really, really great Aaron Copland scores, the scores that we hear so often performed, that we almost we hum them, as we sing them to ourselves as like folk songs. Think of Rodeo, or as some people pronounce it, Rodeo, or Billy the Kid, Appalachian Spring. That was where Copland felt most at home as the kind of the American inheritor of this French Russian ballet tradition, immortalized by composers like Igor Stravinsky and Debussy and Ravel. But he did write symphonies. There's this first symphony I mentioned. There's another symphony, not numbered, very interesting and thorny, difficult, very modern work from the 20s called the Dance Symphony, which I've always loved, but is almost never performed now, sadly. And there is a second symphony, which he called the Short Symphony, which is so incredibly difficult for orchestras to perform that Copland then arranged it into a piece of chamber music, kind of a sextet, which actually gets done rather frequently, but the symphony, the original orchestra version, gets performed very rarely because it's incredibly, for any orchestra, it's incredibly difficult. Well, then something happened called the Great Depression, and then something happened after that called the Second World War. And for those grand histrionic reasons, Aaron Copland felt compelled to write, to make his contribution to the Great American Symphony, much like at this exactly the same time in the middle, the 20th century, these American novelists were compelled to write the great American novel. Think of Fitzgerald writing The Great Gatsby, Hemingway writing A Farewell to Arms, John Steinbeck writing The Grapes of Wrath. It was the same thing with music. There's a reason why Samuel Barber, who, without question, a genius of a composer, whatever his nationality, wrote one symphony in one movement in the 1930s. Then in the 40s, during the war, felt compelled to write a second symphony, and then after the war withdrew it from publication. Like Barber, Copland just didn't feel at home in this very Russian, Germanic world of this massive, symphony in four movements like, Beethoven or Bruckner or Brahms. He just didn't feel at home in that world because, again, it really goes back, my friends, it really does go back to the First World War. And it was the establishment of this American school of music at Fontainebleau, the chateau at Fontainebleau, just outside of Paris. And who we have to thank for it? General Pershing. Yes, General Pershing. This was the role of high culture in America. That General Pershing, the commander-in-chief of the American Expeditionary Force in Europe in World War I, the commander of the army that saved the Allies in World War I, at the end of the war, thought that we needed a higher standard of military band music in America. And so he commanded the establishment of a French music conservatory for Americans in the chateau at Fontainebleau, and Nadia Boulanger was the chief instructor. So if you wonder about this mid-century American, this supposedly quintessentially American kind of open-air sound that you feel in the music of Aaron Copland, Samuel Barber, Walter Piston, Virgil Thompson, Leonard Bernstein, that musical, depiction of those great open spaces of the American West. Well, I hate to ruin your day, but it's actually basically a very French sound. If you looked at the contour of the phrases and the harmonies, it's basically a sound quality that's inherited from Debussy, Ravel, and Gabriel Fauré, and again, Nadia Boulanger. So Copland didn't feel quite at home, but again, this is the age of, during the Second World War, remember, I think it's 1942 that Dmitri Shostakovich writes his massive Symphony No. 7, the Leningrad Symphony, about the spirit of the people of Leningrad, now of course called, again by its old name, its ancient name of St. Petersburg. The spirit, the unbowed spirit of the people of Leningrad in the face of the Nazi invasion. And Shostakovich writes the symphony, and the parts on photographic plates are flown in an airplane over the Arctic Circle to New York, where the premiere, the Western premiere, is conducted. The NBC Symphony Orchestra. Yes, our television networks then had symphony orchestras. The NBC Symphony Orchestra is conducted by Arturo Toscanini. Can you blame Aaron Copland for feeling that he was called upon to write this great heroic, again, this great American novel of a four-movement symphony? Well, that he did, premiered in 1946 by, of course, the Boston Symphony Orchestra, the most Francophile of all American orchestras, and its maestro, the great French-Russian maestro, the dear friend of Nadia Boulanger, of course, Serge Koussevitzky, it was Nadia Boulanger who taught these American composers, and then it was in Paris, and then in Boston, it was Serge Koussevitzky who, through the Koussevitzky Foundation, because he had married the daughter of the wealthiest tea merchant in Russia, it was the Koussevitzky Foundation who would commission works from these young, struggling American composers so they could pay the rent. So you can see how and it all goes back to General Pershing in World War I. Good Lord, what a story. Anyway, so the premiere is in 1946, and in many, many ways, this is Copland at his best. But you can feel that he is, I don't want to say struggling, but you can feel that he's taking on a role to which a kind of a musical call to duty, that, he would be happier in the end of the day writing those immortal ballet scores, but it was time for Aaron to write that symphony, like 4 books from the Old Testament, these 4 great pillars of movements of a symphony. What makes this symphony unforgettable is that it's the basis of all of its thematic material, the kind of the great musical cell of all that you will hear in its 43, 44 minutes is this Aaron Copland piece that we all know and love from 1942, the Fanfare for the Common Man. Aaron Copland was commissioned to write the Fanfare for the Common Man just kind of weeks, days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, and Eugene Goossens, the very, very British music director of the Cincinnati Symphony, almost immediately commissioned a whole boatload of American composers to write fanfares with which the Cincinnati Symphony would begin their concerts of the 1941, 42, 43 seasons. And so the only one of them to be, there were many, many of them, more like a couple of dozen fanfares, and the only one to survive the test of time was Copland's Fanfare for the Common Man. And it caught on so quickly, Copland knew that he had a hit on his hands, and when he was faced again with this musical call to duty to write the Great American Symphony, what does he do? Aaron, that smart boy, what does he do? He goes back and writes a symphony, basically, all around the Fanfare for the Common Man. So there's this slow introduction to the first, basically fast, sonata, allegro, traditional first movement, and in these wide-spaced intervals, in these very French-sounding, wide-open spaces, you can, if you listen carefully, to that slow introduction and the main allegro fast theme, you can hear hints of the fanfare for the common man. Everywhere in this piece, the trumpet section, boy, does that brass section earn their fee in this symphony from beginning to end. The second movement is the scherzo, not the third. The second movement is the scherzo. And this is Copland in, I think one can say unabashedly that this is a classic kind of cowboy scherzo by Copland. It is a dance, a brazen American, very Western sounding dance movement that will remind you immediately of the world of rodeo and Billy the Kid. The slow movement, so serene, again, so French sounding, going back to, again, really before even the French Impressionists of Debussy and Ravel, but even earlier, Gabriel Fauré, a composer of whom actually Copland was very fond. Copland devoted a series of lectures about the music of Fauré during the Second World War as he was a guest lecturer at Harvard. And at that point, nobody knew the music of Fauré. You know, we all now know the Fauré Requiem, but nobody knew his music back then. So it's those thinly textured sonorities. There's no heavy Germanic orchestration. It's all very, very French. And again, this kind of adopted, wide open space American sound. And then the finale, that fanfare, you know you're at the finale when the fanfare for the common man comes bursting in, but elegantly. Copland introduces the theme not in the brass, but in the woodwinds, and then basically builds the whole boisterous finale on that theme of the fanfare for the common man, giving it kind of endlessly contrapuntal treatment. I mean, we think of the French, we Americans very lazily think of the French as kind of undisciplined compared to the Germans, but if you know anything about French musical instruction, it is to this day incredibly, incredibly rigorous and serious. And thanks to Nadia Boulanger, Aaron Copland knew how to write his fugues, let me tell you. I remember people, when I was an undergraduate at Yale, there was some great teachers in the Graduate School of Music who would talk about their days in Paris, and they'd wait, you know, when they were studying at the Paris Conservatoire and the École Normale, and they would wake up at dawn in their little garret in Paris, and they'd have their café au lait and their œuf and their pain, their simple little breakfast, and then they would just start writing fugues. It's an incredibly serious tradition. So Copland has that tradition on full display. And so again, just to finish, the music technically is very French in its sound, and there is more than a hint of the ghost of Dmitri Shostakovich and Sergei Prokofiev, again, those great Soviet composers who wrote these magnificently, in the best sense of the word, these magnificently nationalistic Russian symphonies during the depths of the Second World War. Shostakovich's Leningrad Symphony, Prokofiev's Symphony No. 5, which gets its premiere on the very day that the Soviet troops reach Berlin. There is this Russian, or I should say really properly Soviet music ghost hovering over as well. But at the end of the day, this is an assuredly American masterpiece. And Aaron Copland answered the musical call to duty in this Symphony No. 3 and truly fulfilled his mission. So here, appropriately, I think a great American conductor who has made his career in London at the Royal Opera House at Covent Garden, Sir Antonio Pappano, who I remember as Tony Pappano, a really brilliantly gifted Italian-American boy up the street in Bridgeport, Connecticut, one of the great conductors in Europe, here leading, I think it's very appropriate, one of the great youth orchestras of the world, from a performance at the celebrated summer proms concerts in London, the National Youth Orchestra of Great Britain, and Aaron Copland, one of his crowning glories of his work as a composer, the Symphony No. 3 of 1946.